Good morning everyone and welcome to the second lecture on History of English Language and Literature. In the first introductory series, we saw the development of English through ages, and we also noticed what had been happening in the Anglo-Saxon period and the turn of events which led to the emergence of the Middle English period. We also saw that though the Middle English period was quite eventful to begin with, the most noted name during this period was Chaucer, so much so that even an age was named as Age of Chaucer. Many historians, as we also mentioned in the beginning, they consider Chaucer as a real starting point of English literature. Chaucer lived from 1340 to only till 1400. However, the entire century gets named after this massive figure, Geoffrey Chaucer. He was described as the first of our really national poets, and he was also considered and continues to be considered as the father of English poetry. So, when we look at the opening moments of English literature, it is very important to also understand the time period which Chaucer's life and time covered in terms of social history and the political history of the period. So, in that sense, we begin to see that Chaucer had the rare distinction of having lived under three monarchs. He was born in 1340 during the reign of Edward III, and it was during his lifetime that Richard II succeeded, that was in 1377. He also witnessed two major events, the revolution of 1399, including the deposition of Richard II and also the foundation of the Lancastrian dynasty. And he dies in 1400, 1 year after the ascension of Henry IV. So, this is a very brief introduction towards the life of Chaucer in terms of the social and political history. And moving on, if we look into a bit detailed into the life of Geoffrey Chaucer, he also belonged to the Middle English period and was rightfully known as the morning star of the Renaissance. He was born in London. He was born into a fairly well-to-do family. We know very little about his childhood. Most of the details are not available, but however, we get to know that he was the son of a merchant vintner, a wine merchant, and he lived a fairly luxurious life to begin with. And historians do assume that he also enjoyed the advantages of liberal education, and so much so that the contacts that he made at a very young age were quite significant to begin with. So, right at the age of 17, he had his first court appointment, and he was a page to the wife of the Duke of Clarence, who was also Edward III's son. And we find that by 1359, he also leaves with the English army during one of their wars with France, and he was even taken prisoner during that period. But we find that Edward III, he was too kind and generous towards Chaucer that he chose to ransom him with 16 pounds. 16 pounds was a huge sum in 14th century. If we look at if we compare it with the buying power of the 14th century, the historians do calculate that a single pound was enough to sustain an ordinary man for about 6 months, half a year. So, a 16 pounds was a huge sum of money, and that money was paid to bring back Chaucer as ransom. So, we can even understand the kind of influence and the kind of life that he led, so much so that even the king did care to bring him back as a ransom. He was married too, but we do not have too many details of his domestic life. Historians have not recorded it because many of the things are not available. And he also continued to be closely connected with the court, and he was often sent on diplomatic missions to France, to Italy. So, his exposure was also quite varied. He had a rather luxurious courtly life, and he was sent as ambassadors to different parts of the country, different parts of the world as well. So, he got to travel a lot. That exposure really made Chaucer into the man that he was. So, rightfully he was the appropriate person to begin the story of English literature with, that he had a fine measure of good exposure. He had a way in which he could articulate everything into good writing, and so his writings are considered as the beginning of English literature itself. And there were ups and downs in Chaucer's life. We have already seen how he was sent to Italy in diplomatic missions because he was considered as a fine ambassador to negotiate with the leaders of other provinces and other countries. And he was very much influenced by the Italian culture and early Renaissance. As we know, Renaissance was It had its early beginnings in the land of Italy, and some historians even feel that he may have met Petrarch and Boccaccio, the leading literary writers of the period, and also he was a recipient of many royal favours, and it's said that he even sat in the parliament as Knight of the Shire of Kent. And there was a brief time when his life went through a major crisis. That was a period when the house of Lancastrians were overthrown from power. And we do see that at that point of time that John of Gaunt, who was a major patron of Chaucer, he was banished from court for a brief period, and that time Chaucer fell into poverty, and he saw very difficult times during that period as well. So he even thought that he might end his life in poverty as well, but again the turn of events, thanks to the state of flux in which the political and social life of England was, again we find the Lancastrians coming back to power with the accession of Henry IV, who also happens to be one of John Gaunt's sons. And with that, we find that Chaucer gets a very generous grant of royal pension, and there's an assumption that perhaps he looked forward to a very comfortable life ahead. He even leased out a really big apartment in the center of the nation, but we do find that the life had other plans for him, and he dies within a year of the accession of King Henry IV. So this is a very brief summary of Chaucer's life and how his life was closely connected with the social and political turn of events. And also one important note as far as the history of English literature is concerned, he was the first poet to be buried in Westminster Abbey, a very prestigious place, and the place in which he buried is now known as Poets' Corner, and it's also a much favoured site for the tourists as well. It's very important to see how Chaucer's England was fashioned, so that it influenced his writings, and so much so that an entire period came to be known as the Age of Chaucer as well. So social historians also prefer to call this period as Chaucer's England, because it continued to influence the ways in which the writing of that period was produced, and also it influenced the ways in which English literature and the general English language was beginning to get fashioned. So we also saw in the introductory session about how in the Middle English period, after the Norman conquest, England began to emerge as a distinct nation. There was an increased sense of nationalism, a sense of nationhood. They began to emerge more with native influences rather than with the foreign Italian or French influences. So we also find the standardization of English language. If you remember, it was Chaucer's language and King Alfred's language, the East Midland dialect, which emerged as the standard English, which continued to be used even in the contemporary. And we also find that it was not merely English which was used in Chaucer's England. The clergy continued to use Latin, which was the language of ecclesiastical power, and the courtiers continued to use French language as well. French for a very long time, in fact, continued to be the language of the royalty, and it was also used in some measures in law codes until a statute which came to be issued directed that English should completely replace the usage of French. And this period, the Middle English period, Chaucer's England, especially 14th century, was dominated by the Roman Catholic Christianity. The clergy enjoyed a lot of power, and we also find a certain kind of revival happening within Christianity in England. A little bit of that we will be seeing in detail shortly. And there is expansion of trade as Britain consolidates itself as a nation, and also understands the possibility of expanding itself in terms of land, in terms of trade, so on and so forth. And during this period, thanks to the connection with Italy and the influences of Renaissance from there, we also find that there is a renewed interest in the literature of classical antiquity, especially literature in Greek and Rome. And there is also this influence of humanism, which is connected to the emergence of Renaissance, and we find that there is a free secular spirit, a spirit of inquiry which is beginning to emerge, that also qualifies much of the writing and thought of the later periods in England. And it's during this period that Oxford emerges as an intellectual center, and we do see John Wycliffe's major influence, a major contribution in shaping Oxford into the intellectual center that it is today. And it was only a little later, by the 15th and 16th centuries, that Cambridge emerges as a prominent center as well. And this is the period which also witnessed a lot of changes in the university system. We find that the collegiate system, which most of the Commonwealth nations also continue to follow, the foundations of this English college system was laid in during the 14th century in Chaucer's England. There were various reasons, various socio-political reasons that contributed to make England as one of the founding civilizations of modern period itself. So, having lived during that period, Chaucer did enjoy a lot of these advantages, and in his writings also we see a reflection of this refinement, this exposure, and this increased growth that England was getting used to. Yeah, but at the same time, it's very important for us to note that Chaucer also lived in a century which was very eventful. Chaucer's England was not all about political stability, was not all about the golden period, the flowering period of English language and literature. It was very eventful in the political sense, in terms of other kinds of crises, in terms of the common life of people, so on and so forth. Yeah. We'll take a quick look at the turn of events during Chaucer's England and how it adversely affected the progress of England in the 14th and the 15th century. We find that the England during that time, it was quite affected by plagues. Mainly we have the major plague which swept through most of Europe and Britain. It was Black Death. That was quite a tragic event to begin with, and there was a continuous occurrences. In fact, Britain was under the attack of the Black Death 4 times almost consecutively, and that had even wiped out half the population. The nation had to struggle a lot to engage with, to deal with these crises. There were also a lot of peasant rebellions because England was still under the feudal order, and that had resulted in a lot of unrest and lot of difficulties for the peasants. There was also massive corruption, mainly within the Roman Catholic Church. Yeah. In this context, it is useful to remember that there were a lot of monasteries that and the other institutions that the Roman Catholic Church had established, and these were also breeding grounds for a lot of corruptive activities. The common man was quite upset by the many things which were happening about the luxurious life that most of the clergy were leading, and the clerks who were employed within this institution were also contributing to the corruption in many different ways. And this was also affecting the people in another sense, in the sense that there was a heavy taxation which was imposed upon them. And the taxation was quite doubled by the effect of the wars that happened. One of the major wars that we will be taking a look at is the 100 Years' War. The war was fought with France for over 116 years, though it comes to be known as the 100 Years' War. And there was prevalent anarchy because of all these things put together. There were massive deaths, rebellion, corruption, wars, heavy taxation. The common man was not living a life of luxury like the courtiers, but he was bearing the brunt of all these events put together. And in that sense, it was an age of glaring social contrast, as we would see. On the one hand, there was a very lavish kind of pageantry going on, and on the other hand, people lived in adverse poverty. There was robust vigor and good health and a lot of good things happening on the one hand. On the other hand, we had death, crippling diseases, so on and so forth. On the one hand, elegant literature such as Chaucer's and many others, it began to flourish. It is seen as the beginning of English literature. But on the other hand, there was also widespread illiteracy. Here it is also important to note there is some linguistic element here as well. England also had these languages such as Latin and French. As we mentioned, Latin was the language of church, of clergy, and French was the language of the courtiers. So, there was very little attention, a formal attention paid to English language in the beginning, but we do see that a lot of concerted effort went into making English language the medium of the common people and also the church also in certain ways, especially the activities of Reformation, also paid to the emergence of English as a common language, the translations of Bible into the vernacular by John Wycliffe, and more importantly most of the leading writers of the period, including Geoffrey Chaucer, he wrote in English, making the language more bringing the language closer to the common man as well. So, coming back to our point, on the one hand there was this emergence of elegant literature, and on the other hand there was widespread illiteracy of the common people. And also this brings reminds us that literature and all the other reading material which was available during that period, the target audience was mainly the courtiers and the nobles and the clergy, and there was very little available for the common man as such. Yeah. And also fourthly, on the one hand there was this revival of religious faith which happened. It was also known as Reformation. A more detailed study of social history will take us into the specific details of this event, which swept across Europe and Britain in the 14th and 15th century, which also laid a proper cultural foundation to the England, which was set to begin on a golden period from the 16th century onwards. And on the other hand, there was widespread corruption in church, which was leading to a whole lot of hostility and a lot of disgruntled feelings among the people. Yeah. And as we mentioned earlier, the wars were contributing in a tremendous way to the general peace and the general life of England in many ways. So, we need to take a look at the 100 Years' War, which qualifies to be one of the major sources of heavy taxation. It also heavily drained the resources of England. This makes it important for us to understand the trajectory of this war, which was spread over 116 years, a little more than 100 years, though for convenience historians have chosen to name it as a 100 Years' War. The origins of this contest with France, it dates back to 1066 AD. If you remember, that was when the Norman conquest happened. So, then William the Conqueror, who led the Norman conquest against the English, against the Anglo-Saxons and won over them, he ended up ruling England and Normandy in France together. There was the island of England on one hand and Normandy in France on the other. So, all the subsequent kings of England, they continue, all the successors continue to rule England and Normandy simultaneously, and it was seen as quite a rightful claim as well. Also, we notice that from the time of Henry II, there are a lot of territorial disputes which emerge, and it also becomes a little difficult to control the land which is situated in a distant land, and around the same period, this difficulty in controlling the land leads to a lot of territorial disputes between England and France, leading to a lot of hostile emotions as well. And if you remember, it is around the same period in the 14th and 15th century that England also in England French also begins to lose its prominence and loses out to the English language. So, a lot of factors contribute to this hostility, and this becomes a triggering factor to contribute towards a warlike situation as well. And what happens by the reign of Edward III is quite significant. We find that by 1327, compared to the entire land of Normandy, there are only two provinces left in France under the control of England. This is a major source of concern, as the source of revenue is also getting limited, and also the English kings begin to take it as a matter of prestige, as a matter of honor. And around the same time, we find that in France certain other turn of events are happening. So, this is France in 1328. So, in 1328 in France, King Charles IV, he dies and there is no heir. And Edward III is the king of England during this period, and Edward III's mother, who is Isabella? Isabella happened to be Charles IV's sister. So, Edward III's mother Isabella assumes that since Charles IV has died leaving no heir as a successor, they assume that there is a rightful claim for Edward III. We also should remember that he was only 15 years old then. Yeah. So, Edward III and his mother, they assume that there is a rightful claim for Edward III to the crown of France. So, they lay a claim to the English king Edward III, who happens to be the nephew of the deceased king Charles IV. He lays a claim to the crown of France, which is not taken very kindly by the French people, because they had other plans in hand, and they also there is this rule which prevails in France that one can become king only through their father's line and not through their mother's line. But in England, one can become king through either way, through the father's line or through the mother's line. So, because of this, the French people are very unhappy with Edward III accessing the crown of France, and with this kind of dispute emerges, and France in general was against this, and they bring in a new king, and the 100 Years' War, we find it breaks out. And it was at this point of time that the 100 Years' War breaks out between England and France. And to be noted, this was not a single series of war happening. It was a series of, it was not a single war which happened between England and France. In fact, it was a series of wars, a series of battles which happened, and there was in the initial period, the victory was mostly on the English side, but eventually it happened so that France wins over, and even the two provinces which were held by Britain, they lose out on those two provinces by 1453 by the end of the war. We shall not be getting into further details of the 100 Years' War, but some of the details we shall be taking a look at again when we engage with the 15th century, because the war is spread over such a long time that it continued to inform the ways in which the socio-political history of Britain was formed. So, coming back to our original point, due to these various things happening, especially as the age was dominated by war, the general mood of 14th century, it was not very favorable for the common man. But in spite of that, we do find that Chaucer continued to write, and he gets qualified as the father of English literature itself. So, this is how we sum up the challenging period of 13th and 14th century. There was famine, there was death, anarchy, tyranny, wars, heavy taxation, and you name it and you had it. It was such a challenging period for Britain. And if we just try to sum up this age, there were three major influences that shaped Chaucer's age. There was social and political unrest. There was Reformation happening at the religious side, with a Reformation happening within the Roman Catholic Church, and also Christianity in general. There was also this major influence of Renaissance. So, Chaucer's writings also, we can see a reflection of all of these things happening in Chaucer's writings, though he was not entirely a poet of the people. He was mostly a court poet. We shall be coming to that in a short while. And before that, it is important to note that Chaucer's writings can be divided into three different periods. There was a French period, an Italian period, and an English period. During the French and the Italian period, we find that Chaucer was heavily influenced by the writers of France, by the writers from Italy, and also a major influence of the Renaissance ideals were also got into his writings, his thought processes, the way in which his writings were structured, the metrical schemes that he used, the alliterations that he used, so on and so forth. Some of his major works include Troilus and Cressida, House of Fame, and Parliament of Fowls, but his magnum opus was certainly Canterbury Tales. This was during a time when English language was vying with French and Italian and Latin, and we also find that Canterbury Tales, in terms of English language studies and literary studies, it led to the standardization of English language and also to the popularization of the language. And significantly, though a lot of things were happening in the 14th century, though the century was quite eventful, not just in terms of socio-political unrest, also in terms of the major crisis and the major turn of events that went through this century, Chaucer's writings were quite removed from the realities of the times, in the sense that he continued to be influenced by all these happenings in and around him, but his writings per se, we cannot find a reflection of the times. That was primarily because he was not a poet of the people, he was a court poet. He wrote for the courtiers. His influences were primarily surrounded by all courtly influences. So, there was very little connection that he had with the ordinary people, though he knew the people through his travels, through the various kinds of offices that he held, the various ways in which he could interact as a bureaucratic officer. But other than that, his life was primarily surrounded by courtiers, and there was a way in which he could stay away, he could afford to stay away from the major religious and social movements of the period. And we also find it in his writings. What makes his writings very significant is that many historians and the literary critics of the later period, they feel that it was in his work that the first full expression of the English sense of humor was found. As one of the historians would describe it, the English sense of humor was partly cynical and mostly kindly. So, it has its origins in Chaucer's writings and Chaucer's expressions. And we find that Chaucer was heavily influenced by the Italian humanism. So, though he belonged to the courtly class, though there was a way in which he was removed from the ground realities of the society, he was inspired by the free and secular spirit which was contributed by the Italian humanism and also the various other Renaissance ideas. So, this had led to a lot of freeness in his writings and a lot of gender liberalism in his writing as well. Yeah. So, we need to take a very detailed look at Canterbury Tales, which is the magnum opus of Chaucer, and also the defining work that inaugurated English literature in many different ways. If we try to summarize Canterbury Tales, it is an unfinished collection of 24 comic and moral stories. It was a set of stories told by a group of pilgrims on their way to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury. This was structured in such a way that it was a story within a story. There is this major framework of story happening, which is the travel of a certain set of characters to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, and they decide to tell a story on the way, 2 stories on the way and 2 stories on their way back, and in order to keep them out of boredom and also to keep each other company. And they also decide that the best storyteller will get a free meal at Tabard Inn. That is from where they began their journey. So, this main story, and within this is a main story, and within the framework of this main story, there are these different tales which are being told by different characters in Canterbury Tales. So, this is in fact a story within a story. The structure is in such a way. So, this Canterbury Tales, though it is written by Chaucer, who was a courtly figure, we get snapshots of the age in very different ways. We get a sense of the medieval life through a range of characters that he portray before us. In fact, this is the most elaborate and the most extensive kind of portrait of the medieval period in that sense. We have, for instance, certain characters from the old feudal order, including the knight, squire, the yeoman and the ploughman. From the merchant class, there is the character of the merchant, the man of law, guildsman, and the cook. From the ecclesiastical class or from the clergy, we have prioress, the monk, a friar and a pardoner, and each one of them, they have a different tale to tell, and all these tales, interestingly, are very entertaining, it's hilarious, and it's open to a range of interpretations. And it is in this range that we find the exemplary skill of Chaucer the man, because we do see that though he was apparently removed from the harsh realities of 14th century, his tales reflect that he did have a sound knowledge of what was happening in and around him. And also the entire work is structured and fashioned in such a way that it continues to hold the interest of many critics and historians, even in the contemporary. And for someone who is very interested in the studies of rhetoric, the studies of how English literary studies evolved, the Canterbury Tales also present an interesting literary tour. Though this is as early as the 14th century, when many of the different genres of writing had not yet begun to emerge, we get a literary tour, a fairly extensive tour through different forms of writing such as romances, fabliaux, and there are these occasions where stories of saints' lives are retold, there are allegories. So, in many ways it is a wonderful treat for any student of literature when they begin their studies. And this work, Canterbury Tales, it was written over a span of time during Chaucer's lifetime, but it was properly published only in 1478 after Caxton's printing press was installed in England. So, it was quite fortunate that unlike the many other texts of the Old English period, Canterbury Tales was not lost or forgotten, but it was preserved quite well into the posterity thanks to the techniques of printing that emerged in Britain during that time. Having said that, the 14th century was also an age of transition in many different ways. Even while the writing of English literature was getting consolidated in the 14th century, there were many other events which contributed to the consolidation of English language and literature. For instance, it is during this period that we see the rise of the middle class. We see the rise of the middle class, the birth of nationalism, the transition from feudal to free society, and more importantly the emergence of humanism, which fostered a spirit of inquiry, a questioning attitude, a critical attitude, a lot of enthusiasm for new learning, and very importantly the expansion of English literature as well. So, when we say that a lot of things were happening during this period, it would be quite natural to expect a little more than Chaucer out of this period, because this was in many ways a fertile ground for the emergence of new languages, new literatures. So, it was only quite natural that there were other poets also who wrote during this period. However, it is just a happy accident of history that Chaucer gained prominence over all the other writers. So, this is not the time for us to evaluate or to critically engage with why certain writers gain more prominence over the others in literary history, but we do note that there were other writers during this time, especially poets such as John Gower and William Langland, and they were quite different from Chaucer. None of them had stately positions, and they were not really court poets to begin with. And John Gower, in fact, he wrote a lot about the unstable state of contemporary English literature, and he also presented, unlike Chaucer, a gloomy view of the social conditions of the time. He was quite aware of the challenges that the age was going through, and we do see a very severe criticism of the clergy in his writings. This was something that Chaucer hardly engaged with. In Canterbury Tales, we do find a satirical way through which Chaucer tries to critique, but we do not find any open criticism in Chaucer's writings. But John Gower was quite open about his criticism, and he was also sympathetic to the teachings of Wycliffe and his followers. Reformation was entirely spearheaded by Wycliffe in England, and his significance is quite noted by social historians. But in Chaucer, we do not find much of a reflection of the spirit of Reformation. On the other hand, in poets such as John Gower's and in William Langland's writing, there is a way in which we find that the ideals of Reformation had contributed a lot to the emergence of literature. But John Gower lost out in certain ways because he did not write entirely in English. He was one of those many writers who could not make up his mind concerning the best medium, because if you think about those times, in 13th, 14th and 15th century was a period of transition, and there was no way in which one could predict which language would have dominance in the preceding in the following times. So, Chaucer was perhaps more insightful and had better foresight, or perhaps he was just fortunate to have written all his works mostly in English, but there were a lot of writers like John Gower who were still writing in many different languages at the same time, in French, Italian, Latin, and also in English. So, because of that, we have little access to the works of John Gower written in languages other than English, because they were not included in the proper tradition of English literary studies. And there was William Langland, whose work, The Vision of William Concerning Pius the Plowman, it was considered almost at par with Canterbury Tales, except that he gave a very different view of England, and many historians feel that Langland's writings complement Canterbury Tales and Chaucer's writings quite well. Langland's work is considered as a first provincial work in English, and also he had vehemently exposed the sloth and vice of the church, and he sets on record the struggles and the virtues of the common man, which is something that is severely lacking in Chaucer's works. And there is lot of critical work available on to the ways in which Chaucer and Langland presents the medieval age in very different ways. Our purpose here is not to judge or evaluate them, but to see them for their literary merit as well as for the ways in which they have contributed, they have worked as a mirror of those times to help us understand how writers positioned in different locations, different historical and political locations, looked at different ages and how each age was represented as well. And this also gives us a sense of how the same age ends up producing writers of different caliber and writers who look at the spirit of the times in very different ways. And there's also John Barber, who is considered as a father of Scottish poetry. His work Prose in 1375, that is considered as a history of Scotland's struggle for freedom, and it is considered as a seminal work which even later on brings together these different but related histories in the larger scheme of literary studies. And there was very limited prose during Chaucer's age, medieval age. In fact, poetry was beginning to flourish, poetry was thriving, but just as in the Anglo-Saxon period, in the Old English period, prose had very little to contribute in terms of literature. It was merely functional, in a sense that prose was used to communicate, but it had not yet come up to the level of literature as we understand literature today. And Chaucer also wrote a lot of prose, but very little has been included as literature, and compared to Canterbury Tales, his poetic work, most of them do not even stand a chance. And the very important work during this period was perhaps Wycliffe's translation of the entire Bible from Latin to English. This had a huge influence in the 14th and in the subsequent centuries, because until then the Bible was far removed from the common man, and it was only accessible to the clergy. The interpretations were available only with the clergy. They almost held a monopoly over Bible. So Wycliffe's translations, it was quite revolutionary in that sense. It brought religion closer to the common man, and it also ensured that religion does not remain as a monopoly of the church or of the clergy. And for those of you who are more interested in knowing about the social and religious history of the times, it would be very useful to read up a little more on Wycliffe and also on Reformation. In fact, Wycliffe's influence was so widespread that his pamphlets, which were mostly controversial, they even led to a lot of crisis within the Oxford University. He was in fact charged of a lot of such controversial charges as well. But in the end, as far as language and literature is concerned, his writings were very useful in showing the power of vernacular for theological discussions, to show that English language can lend itself to not just imaginative literature, not just fanciful literature, but also it is useful for carrying out powerful and serious theological discussions. And the other work which has lived on to the posterity is the Travels of Sir John Montville, whose authorship remains contested. And there are different theories about this work, which was hugely popular during that period, and some of the historians feel that it could be a compilation of many interesting and imaginative stories translated from French. However, it continues to be considered as the first English prose classic available, though the authorship is quite contested. And moving on to the century soon after, in fact, Chaucer's influence was so tremendous that the 13th century gets branded as the period, the century before Chaucer, and the 15th century gets branded as the period after Chaucer. Chaucer becomes a defining way in which literature begins to be defined, shaped, and even spoken about centuries later. The 15th century after Chaucer, it was quite barren in terms of literary output. However, it remained very significant as a preparatory period, taking us to the golden period of the 16th century, the Elizabethan era. So, in the next lecture, we will be taking a look at how the 15th century gets designated as a preparatory period for this golden period to follow, and also we will be taking a look at in detail as some of the socio-political and literary ways in which the 15th century was fashioned. Thank you for listening.